Very pleased to open this meeting and introduce Professor Tom Churcher from Imperial College. He's a man of many talents. I'm looking at his bio. He's not only an epidemiologist, but also an entomologist and mathematical modeler. I like it in his bio, working out the best way to kill mosquitoes and eliminate vector-borne diseases. I mean, he's going to tell us about his work today, optimizing the epidemiological benefit of vector control against malaria. So Tom, you're very welcome. I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Caroline, and thanks for the invite, and thank you for turning up. So yeah, I suppose perhaps just building on from that, I suppose my background isn't necessarily the standard for people that do mathematical modelling. I was originally an entomologist, running around trying to catch other things other than mosquitoes. But then I got my PhD, and we didn't get the fieldwork funding that I intended to do for my PhD. So I ended up doing mathematical modelling, and haven't really looked back. So I'm going to keep this talk quite light on some of the kind of more detailed maths behind the model, but more talking about the public health implications and work on malaria control programs to try and improve, or as I say, optimizing the epidemiological benefit of vector control. So please, if there's anything people would like to interrupt us for clarification or any questions during the talk, please do so. Otherwise, there should be plenty of time at the end. So I'm sure everybody's very aware of malaria, but I think it's always worth just kind of putting these kind of numbers up at the start of a talk about the disease, because they are huge and terrifying. And all this data comes from the World Malaria Report, which is published December each year, and reports really the kind of last year's data on what's going on. So it was published in 2022, but the latest information we get is 2021. And so what we've seen is malaria incidence go down quite substantially since the turn of the century, but which has been very positive, and there's lots of positive things to take from this. But overall, the total number of cases has broadly stayed roughly the same as populations have grown in these regions. Much more successful is the reduction in estimated numbers of deaths. And you can see that there's been quite substantial reduction since the turn of the century, primarily through the use of good drugs to treat the disease. However, you'll see that the vast majority of malaria cases are concentrated within a few countries, particularly mostly in Africa, and there's real problems associated with the disease in this and other areas. I should stress, though, that these data are all modelled, as in, so for the majority of countries where these is prevalent, it's generally been decided that the self-reporting from the health systems is not reliable enough to support this kind of long-term trend analysis. And so it's always important to remember that actually these values are based on geospatial models, and they're very good geospatial models. They're run by the Malaria Atlas project, which was in Oxford University, but is now in Perth. But they are always generated by these geostatistical models, and though these models are as good as they can be, we have to take them often with the level of uncertainty that actually, if you speak to the people involved, they are very aware of the uncertainty of this, and so we will talk a bit about that later. So though we've seen relatively reductions in relatively few, well, a moderate reduction in incidence, a lot of the data these models are based on prevalence surveys, and that's where we actually have seen better performance. And so since the turn of the century, we have seen, and this is from the Malaria Atlas project, it's a bit of an old paper now, but between 2000 and, which is in plot A on the left, we have seen reductions in disease prevalence quite substantially between 2000 and 2015. Since 2015, things have kind of stalled, and the plot on the right is just an indication of, for example, what we're actually seeing from for example, in this situation, Burkina Faso, where the reported number of cases, even though the geospatial models predict that disease prevalence has gone down quite substantially, and the clinical cases from that as a result have gone down quite substantially over that period of time. During this period of time, we've seen substantial increases in the kind of country reported cases. And so this is inevitably the case when you have improving health systems. The first thing you start seeing is actually more malaria cases, not less. So understanding what's going on is quite complicated. And just to stress that this is so effectively the World Malaria Report numbers are model numbers, and they require a kind of geospatial model to do that. And so the benefit of the geospatial model is that it's using data from all across Africa. But in that situation, you might be missing something that's going on locally. And as I will talk about later, there was reasons to think that something different might be happening in Burkina Faso, which actually could be partially explaining a rise in cases, even though the geospatial model was effectively saying there was a decrease. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that and how you express that uncertainty and find out what's going on now. So the main reason for the reductions in disease prevalence are through the widespread use of vector control interventions. So there's various ways of controlling malaria. At the moment, the ones recommended by the WHO and implemented by the Global Fund are quite limited in number. Long-lasting insecticidal treated nets, LLINs or ITNs, are by far the most widespread used. And a paper by Sam Batt in 2015, shown on the right-hand side, showed that the kind of real reduction in disease burden, which is seen in this red line here as contribution of effectively disease prevalence in affected areas, you can see there's been quite a substantial reduction in infected areas, but the majority of that has been through the widespread distribution of these long-lasting insecticidal treated nets. There are other control interventions, indoor residual spraying for one. Spatial repellents are starting to be used, but at a really relatively low scale, as is larval control. Drugs, there's clearly been some benefit to drugs, and a lot of the saving of lives over the period of time have been through much better medications, particularly switching to RCTs, so Optimising combination therapies, but also the mass distribution of drugs, either through mass distribution campaigns, but mostly through seasonal malaria chemoprevention, drugs to children a couple of times a year to kind of reduce the kind of the reservoir of infection. But I'm going to talk mostly about insecticidal treated nets. So you can see one up here being used because that has by far been the biggest impact over the last 15 to 20 years. And the insecticide treated net is a great invention. The important bit is the insecticide. And so what some of the problems of understanding what's going on here is that the net has two benefits. It has the benefit of a physical barrier that prevents mosquitoes from actually getting to somebody. But what's more important, we think, is that it's covered in insecticide. So somebody sleeping under a bed net, the mosquito comes in, tries to bite them, they hit the net and they die, which is great because that stops them from biting you when you get out of your bed net in the morning, or it stops them from going and biting somebody else. So effectively, the insecticide turns it from a personal protection device, which we actually think epidemiologically doesn't have that much impact because mosquitoes are plastic. If you're hungry, you don't just go, oh, I can't get some food now, I'm gonna go and die. You wait until the morning and then you try and fight somebody then. But the fact that it's got insecticide on it has been a real key thing to disease control. And so I downloaded this morning, and this is the total number of bed nets that have been distributed since the year 2004. And you can see it's over 2.5 billion nets and counting. So a huge number of nets distributed mostly towards Africa. And you will see that there's only been one type of bed net that's been distributed up until around 2018. And this was the pyrethroid only bed net. And there are different types of pyrethroid, but they're all within the same class of insecticide. And this is because to make bed nets, you have to make them really safe. You know, these kind of bits of insecticide treated cloth are going to be chewed on. They're going to be people sleeping under them, so they need to be exceptionally safe insecticides. So the pyrethroids were developed a long time ago and have been used pretty much solely on these nets since then. I'll come back to the other types of nets that we're talking about a little bit later. You can see there's an awful lot of bed nets being used out, particularly in Africa. And so the Malaria Atlas Project do a really nice job of collating all this information and actually showing how over time, since the turn of the century, we've got much higher levels of bed net use and access across Africa. And you can see from this map here that's from Amelia that really large areas of the continent have really very high use of bed nets in areas which are affected by malaria. Now, unfortunately, inevitably in these situations, as something is used at scale, mosquitoes have adapted to it. So evolution is a powerful force. And as historically we've always been using the same type of insecticide, unsurprisingly, mosquitoes have developed resistance to this insecticide because, as you can see, the selection pressure is huge. Quite what the epidemiological consequences of this is very unclear. And what we have is what we do is we get a cup of mosquitoes, we put them in either one of these WHO tube tests or effectively one of these bottles, and you see basically, given a defined concentration of an insecticide, how many of those mosquitoes die. If you did this at the turn of the century, 2000, they'd have all died. Now on the y-axis, on the right-hand side of this plot, you can see predictions that we've done using data collected by the WHO and others. And you can see over time, resistance has spread really high. So here you have lots of different colors for different admin units in different countries. Y-axis, we have the level of resistance, and over the x-axis, you have time. And so you can see in many African countries, the level of resistance now is really quite high in lots of locations. Particularly highlight, I'm going to be talking a bit more about that later, is Burkina Faso, where really high levels of resistance going on. The data is all very noisy. Mosquitoes are very complex, but there's also the kind of passage of where it's going is very clear. We have some genetic markers for resistance, and you can see this from a paper by Penny Hancock, amongst others. But at the moment, we don't really have a good phenotypic. We've got lots of markers that are associated with resistance, but mosquitoes are complicated things, and there are lots of different ways to try and overcome resistance. You could metabolize the insecticide. You could effectively develop thicker cuticle, which means it's absorbed slower. And so there's kind of some association between genotype and phenotype. Actually, we haven't got a particularly good set of markers that can, at the moment, that can describe the overall phenotype. Hopefully that's coming soon, but currently it's not the case. And so what we're seeing is that we've had a huge number of increase in these resistant mosquitoes over time, and the impact that's having on malaria control is somewhat unknown. So pretty much the majority of products that are given out, so the over years there's been lots of different ways of assessing the effectiveness of bed nets, and this is typically done by cluster randomized controlled trials. And these are important is because clusters, the main impact of the bed net is this public health benefit. It's for the community. Effectively, you've got this personal protection, but actually the main benefit is through killing mosquitoes. And so you need to do these trials at large cluster level size. And this means that they're actually quite costly and slow. And there's been a kind of real lack of development of new bed nets over the last 30 years or so. We've relied very much on the pyrethroid only net. And it's very difficult to kind of bring a new net into the market, which means that we haven't had very many for quite a long time. And the WHO, amongst others, the majority of bed nets are distributed through, for example, the Global Fund, and the Global Fund require evidence, a product to be recommended by the WHO before they recommend a new product. And historically, the WHO has required epidemiological evidence of the benefit of a net. This has been important at the start of the process, because we need to get epidemiological evidence of the benefit of this before we can really invest money in it. But what that does generate is it does slow the process down. And so what we've done here on the graph here, we've kind of summarized all the randomized controlled trials looking at insecticide treated nets. And you can see there's quite a large body of evidence. But these trials are actually done quite sporadically, and historically haven't been done particularly well, haven't been particularly well powered. And also it's quite difficult to actually compare trials, what's going on. Because as you can see here, we've got on the right hand side, we've got all the different RCTs that have been done. And then what you have is you have different endpoints have been used throughout the different trials. And the color of the kind of square is indicating the efficacy at a particular time point. And what you can see certainly is that efficacy goes up and down over time as the bednet ages and as seasonality changes. And so it makes it quite difficult to judge what's going on. And this is especially the case when we have insecticide resistance, because obviously you cannot randomize insecticide resistant mosquitoes to different communities. You can't do that. So therefore it makes it very difficult in this kind of gold standard method for assessing the impact of resistance, because effectively it's spreading at a rate that you can't control, and it's very difficult to compare areas with and without resistance. So for a long time there was a resistance to resistance, as if it were, and people were very reluctant to kind of call it out as an issue. And that is probably for very good reason, is because effectively if you have a product that is working less well, then obviously people might be less likely to use it. So I was going to start introducing the models, and malaria is a very complicated disease involving transmission within humans, so multiple life stages, lots of different acronyms for the different life stages. Seriously, it took me my whole PhD just to understand the basic different names that malariologists have for the different parasite stages. But you have quite a lot of complexity going on within the human, both within the mosquito, and as we all know, the dynamics of disease are controlled by how many mosquitoes there are in a region and how good they are at transmitting the disease. And so we need to capture all these elements in a transmission dynamics model if we're going to try and understand the disease. And so pretty much there's not one malariologist or entomologist out there that is insulted by when we effectively reduce this really complicated life cycle down to inevitably a compartmental model with lots of arrows, but effectively summarizing their life's work into a little box if they're lucky, and not doing that. Nevertheless, this is what we have done, and we have developed one of the most widely used malaria models in the world. And this is a kind of very simplified graphic of it. But there's an awful lot of things going on behind the scenes. For example, there's lots of variability caused by immunity. Immunity is in malaria is a key driver of transmission, but it's partially effective, and so we have to really track a person's history of malaria control to understand what's going on with that. Gets bitten more than others, but we have to incorporate that level of heterogeneity because that has important interactions with both immunity and other things. And for us, we're the effectiveness of controlled interventions. And so when we start trying to look at the effectiveness of bed nets, we've got to kind of think of what actually the mosquito is doing and the bed net is doing. And obviously one thing to do is it's killing adults. It's killing adults, and what this does is reduces but all nets, they will reduce biting, and they might have other impacts, such as by killing mosquitoes, you reduce fecundity of the mosquitoes, and just by exposure to the parasite, to insecticide, you might reduce fecundity as well. So you're reducing both the number of adults that are laying eggs, but also the transmission probability, the number of eggs laid per adult that is potentially being exposed. there's a lot of complexity in understanding the impact of these interventions and ultimately understanding the problems associated with insecticide resistance. So what we do is we use a really nice biological assay, quite a complicated biological assay called the experimental hut. Now, these are widely used across Africa. There's various different designs. They're basically like a fake house. And within these fake houses, you have somebody sleeping, a volunteer sleeping under a bed net. And inside that, you have effectively the house is built to be ant proof, because inevitably, if a mosquito dies, an ant will eat it or carry it away or something. And so effectively what you've developed as these kind of like structures that either are on stilts or have like moats that stop the marauding ants from coming in and carrying off your mosquitoes. So what we do is the volunteer sleeps under the net during the night, while mosquitoes enter naturally through the eaves and such like. They get inside, they either get killed by the insecticide in the net or they try and escape, and then they end up in traps on the windows or verandas that stop them from getting out. And we did a meta-analysis of these studies from across Africa, and this is quite out of date now because the number of studies that have gone up in the last couple of years is quite huge. But when we did the meta-analysis in 2019, there were over 150 experimental hut trials that have been done over the last 20 years, and that number is rapidly expanding. And the important thing is they're done in a much wider geographical location than the cluster randomized control trials that have been used, giving you a much broader idea of the impact on the mosquito population than perhaps a cluster randomized trial would do. So this is an experimental hut trial site from Tanzania, and what we do is we use this data to assess the different impacts of the intervention, in this case a bed net, on the different aspects of mosquito life cycle. So what we use is, if somebody's in here with a mosquito net, the chance of a mosquito coming into this hut is diminished, because in some respects we think the mosquito detects the insecticide and therefore more likely go into a different hut. So this is what we call deterrence. Of those that go inside the hut, some of them will be killed, some of them will be blood fed, and then some of them will exit and then try and feed again. So they might go in there and they might not feed, they might not be killed, but they will just leave anyway because the person is under a net and they don't like the insecticide on that net. They might be causing something like a repellency. And so what we do is we effectively use these interventions, use these huts. And this is a typical result that you see from, you have a control hut where you've got an untreated net in there, and you can see the percentage of mosquitoes that go in and bite. They're the red ones. You see the ones that die, which are the blue ones. So if you've got an untreated net, you don't have very many mosquitoes dying. If you look at the this middle panel is a treated Permanet 3, which has got some insecticide on there, and you can see this is an unwashed net, and so it's quite a large number of mosquitoes go in there and then they die. There's an awful lot of noise, but you see a lot of mosquito killing and much less blood feeding than you would have saw without the insecticide on the net. And we use this to characterize the different behaviors and look at the variability and understand what goes on. And these are really nice experiments that allow us to, mosquito data is inevitably noisy. You can see the numbers collected each night are really variable, and you can see the mortality rate, for example, varies substantially over this period of time. Nightly, and so there's an awful lot of uncertainty out there. But these huts provide a nice kind of way of characterizing these kind of behaviors quite effectively. So what we did with this meta-analysis, we collected all the data and we looked at the relationships between those different behaviors, so the killing, the blood feeding, the deterrence, and we correlated that with the level of resistance as defined by this couple of mosquitoes that I talked about originally. So give us a couple of mosquitoes, how many die? That gives us a level of an idea of the level of resistance or survival in the susceptibility test. So here we have no resistance, here we have high resistance, and it gives us an outcome of what happens per feeding attempt. Either mosquitoes are killed, they're deterred from going in, or they exit, or they blood feed. And you can see there's non-linear relationships between these different behaviors and the level of resistance as defined in this susceptibility test. So what that allows us to do is we effectively we built a meta-analysis of experimental hutch trial data. And so this is illustrated with a type of indoor residual spraying here against malaria. And you can see here we identified 7 different studies. And you can see the relationship between, for example, how mosquito mortality changed over time is quite variable between the different studies. But what we do is we fit a statistical model to these kind of data, and then we use this model to parameterize our transmission dynamics model of malaria. And you can see this here. And to do that, once we've done that, we effectively try and validate that model by comparing the results to cluster randomized control trials. So in this case, it was done by Natasha Protopopov in Tanzania. That effectively what we do is we fit the model to the first data point, we parameterize the impact of the intervention using this entomological data, and then predict forward and see how well the model is predicted of the data points seen in the cluster randomized control trial. And sometimes we do quite well, such as in this plot, and sometimes we do relatively badly, but it gives us a kind of an objective way of understanding whether our actual models are actually being able to capture what we think is going on in real life situations. So we've effectively done that for the cluster randomized control trials that have been on, and this is a paper that was published by Ellie Sherwood-Smith and myself last year. And effectively we look at this is the efficacy of the hutch as measured by the paper, and this is the efficacy as measured by the cluster randomized control trial. And you can see the efficacy varies quite substantially in different locations according to the different products that were tested, the time at which they were evaluated. And you can see there's no simple estimate for effectively what is a simple bed net, and the efficacy can vary from effectively nothing to over 60%. But our model is able to capture quite a lot of this heterogeneity. It's not perfect, and some trials we do better than others, but overall, we're able to capture the efficacy in the hutch trial broadly without much bias. And this gives us some confidence that the models are kind of broadly working. And this allows us to, for example, predict what the public health impact of, say, resistance in a particular location is. And so when we were talking about Burkina Faso at the beginning of the talk, and we were saying that resistance is quite high there. We've been working very closely with collaborators at CRFP and IRSSS to look at the particular situation in the kind of Banfora region of Burkina Faso. And in those locations, we kind of think, well, okay, the current situation, the baseline is what we think would have happened if no malaria had happened. Current situation is where we were. And I think if we think there would be no bed nets, there would have been not only a reduction of 10%, but if there'd been no pyrethroid resistance, we think that actually the malaria prevalence would have gone down. The number of cases would have gone down an additional 11% compared with what we're looking at. There are other things that are going on in Burkina Faso as well. So SMC, the seasonal malaria chemo prevention, is also having a big impact, and also mosquitoes in Burkina Faso seem to quite like biting outdoors. So therefore, at times when people are not protected by the bed net. But this gives us kind of some idea of trying to look at the counterfactuals and arguing actually this pyrethroid resistance is having a relatively a big impact on disease control. So I wanted to go back. So effectively, we talked about how the majority of these nets have been the standard net. Then people started worrying about insecticide resistance. So they did 2 things. The first thing they did is they developed a PBO net. And this is effectively a pyrethroid only net, but it has a synergist on top of that, which effectively increases the killing. And this bed net was developed quite a long time ago in the early 2000s, but it only really started getting widespread use at the 2018 onwards. And now, the last year of data, over 50% of the bed nets that were distributed, mostly in Africa, were this PBO net. And that's great, but there's been a huge amount of delay in this getting this bed net out, and we think that that has had a substantial public health impact. And part of the issue of that is that these nets, these PBO nets, are inevitably more expensive than the standard net. And there wasn't enough malaria budgets for malaria control as it was, and so therefore it was always a tie-up between, well, do we invest in more bed nets that more people could have, or do we invest in better bed nets? And this is unfortunately always the scenario that we have, that there is an issue, that people because there's not enough budget, we can't invest in these better, more expensive products, really, because there's not enough people that have bed nets anyway. So this was appreciated as a problem, and there was a long delay between there. And so recent years has been this new dual active ingredient net. This is the first kind of net that's been developed with a new insecticide, really, since the first bed net was developed. And it is inevitably more expensive. But what happened was effectively Unitaid and a number of other funders got together and said, look, we think this net is worth investing in, and we will help you, support you with the price. And they provided a price guarantee to get this product out there. And what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years is about 50,000 of these new types of nets go out in the community. And this hasn't been based on any recommendation. But the thing is about these dual active ingredient nets is they already have a pyrethroid insecticide on them. And so therefore, it was decided that even though we didn't know whether this new net was any better or not, we would distribute this net and we would try and collect data as that was being done to try and see if it was worth doing, and try and build up the evidence base. And the good thing about this has done, effectively, it's massively sped up the kind of the adoption of this net. Over 50 million of these nets have now been distributed, and we will show what benefit we think that's been having. But this is effectively a kind of response to this real slow uptake that's we saw by PBO. And this has also allowed, for example, companies with a kind of defined market that was already artificially generated by this Unitaid proposal to actually invest in building infrastructure for new nets. More people are coming on the market, and so inevitably the price of these new nets has actually gone down substantially over time than it was before they were actually started to be widespreadly used. And this brings up right up to date. So last week, the WHO recommended the use of this net, these dual active ingredient nets, based on data from a cluster randomized controlled trial. So throughout the process, we've been working, so even from the very beginning of this project, so that was in the 2000s, it was 2018 it started. We've been working with the Unitaid and under a project called the New Nets Project, which was trying to really quantify the added benefit of this new net. And here on the x-axis you have your mortality, mosquito mortality observed in your pyrethroid-only net. And the y-axis you have more mortality observed in these new nets. And we have these 2 new nets now, the purple one, which is a PBO net, and this green one here, which is this pyrethroid pyrrole net. And this is the results from the cluster randomized controlled trial that was done in Tanzania, led by Jacqueline Mosher and Natasha Protopopov. And you can see in these sites, people stopped using these nets quite quickly, but there was still a substantial difference in malaria prevalence between these 2 communities. So even though 2 years on, less than 50% of the people were actually using these new nets, probably easier to see here, now we can see that actually the malaria prevalence from a baseline value to these values here. The black is the old style net, the purple is the pyrethroid PBO net, and then the green one is this new pyrethroid pyrrole net. And our models that were parameterized using this entomological data were effectively used and we are broadly able to capture the results of these different trials. We're kind of missing some of the seasonality going on here, and there's we still don't really know what's going on with age nets, but it's broadly in line with what we think is going on. And you can see how, yes, we're fairly good at capturing the efficacy of these new interventions, and also predicting clinical incidence, changes in clinical incidence. We're somewhat underestimating the clinical incidence of the purple one compared with the actual trial-derived data, but that's not necessarily surprising given some of the assumptions that we were making about the life expectancy of this net. And one of the useful things about this model is it allows you to look at potentially counterfactual scenarios. So as I mentioned, the cluster randomized control trial showed very clearly it had epidemiological benefit, but the actual magnitude of that benefit was somewhat diminished by people stopping using the trial net relatively quickly. And so what we were able to do is effectively go, okay, in the trial looks on average, the standard net was giving a malaria prevalence of 40%. The new net was giving a malaria prevalence of 34%. But if people had effectively topped up their nets, as would normally be the case from other programs, we think that actually the overall prevalence would have been as low as 23%. So this kind of information is used to effectively to try and predict the overall public health of switching from, for example, a pyrethroid net to another one. And we've also done this in pilot implementation programs. The nice thing about these trials is these were trials were run parallel to the starting of the distribution of these campaigns. And so in various sites in Africa, these new nets were distributed, not in a cluster randomized kind of way, but in a kind of pilot way. And we were broadly able to predict the results of those different trials as well. They were in very different sites, so actually models are really needed because effectively, for example, you can see the standard net went in this site in Burkina Faso, which is very different to this site where the pyrethroid pyrrole nets were distributed. So that's effectively where we are. And I wanted to kind of move this on to effectively talking very briefly. I appreciate I'm very nearly at the 40 minutes I said I would do. I'll just quickly give you a kind of hint of this tool, it's called Mint, and it was primarily developed by Ellie Sherrod-Smith, who's been working with me at Imperial College. And this is an online interface, so I'll see if I can just do a quick live demonstration. It may or may not work. So if you go into mint.did.ac.uk, you will see this interface. I'm actually going to use the development version at the moment, which is actually going live next week. But just for demonstration of the new benefit of the new nets, let's just call this there. And effectively what this allows you to do is you put in the environment at which you want to introduce your net, your history of vector control, your history of malaria control, some information on your mosquito population, and allows you to effectively tailor the scenario to where you are. This allows us to access a bank of 2.5 million simulations that we have sitting on an Imperial College server. The model's quite slow to run, so we don't run this live, but what it allows us to do is effectively start playing around with different combinations of interventions in this particular location. And it allows us to see, for example, how disease prevalence will change over time with no intervention, a pyrethroid-only bed net, a pyrethroid PBO net, or a pyrethroid pyrrole net, IRS, or a combination of these different things. And this allows people to try and predict the public health benefit in their particular location, and then they can change around, for example, malaria prevalence in these different spots to actually to see what's going on, and using information on the mosquito and other things. And we also provide a kind of cost effectiveness tool, because inevitably these new tools are more expensive, and everybody gets quoted different prices. But what you can do is you can put them in here, and you can use this to work out actually what's the most cost-effective tool I have in that particular region. And so this can provide some justification, because inevitably these new nets are more expensive and budgets are limited, but you can now use this to hopefully justify investing in these more expensive products, because you can do things like basic cost-effective analysis and stuff. And so we're increasingly working with national malaria control programs to help them make decisions about the next type of vector control that they're going to do. This is at the very start of this process, and this is an interface that we really need to work on and get some feedback on. But hopefully it will be helping decision makers effectively optimize their use of vector control. So with that, just going back to the presentation. Overall, I suppose I'd like to stress that really there's no one-size-fits-all policy for malaria control. And as you saw from those cluster randomized controlled trials, the efficacy can vary substantially between sites and location. And that will often be driven by what's going on in the mosquito. So the best thing to do in a particular site will vary by setting, and we argue that models can help support this decision-making process, and we can also parameterize these models with entomological data that are collected from these quite complicated real-life assays, and hopefully in the future expedite the time between a new product being developed and its widespread adoption. And I think there's lots of questions for interventions like bed nets where we think what's going on. Can we use this entomology for cluster randomized controlled trials, or what is the potential for potentially using pilot intervention studies to speed up the development of these new products and get them to people using them and hopefully saving lives as a result. With that, I'll stop. This work has been driven by a huge amount of international collaborations, particularly this new net project, which is funded by UNITAID, but also an Essentials project, which is effectively looking at did a lot of the experimental trials using with partners in CNRFP in Burkina Faso, Benin, Tanzania, and Malawi. Have also been very, very key in this, and that's a picture of us all a few weeks ago in a meeting in Tanzania. I just wanted to highlight that I'm actually that really tall one at the back, because I've been giving a lot of Zoom talks recently, and that's my key characteristic. And I think, as Caroline knows, it's the one thing that people remember about me. So if I did it on Zoom, that's obviously not clear. So I'm the tall one at the back. And with that, thank you very much for your time. I'm very happy to take any questions that people might have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. That's a fantastic talk. Please do raise your